I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. What does the fine print reveal about how governments across Canada plan to fast-track massive energy projects? From coast to coast, provincial governments are fixated on natural resource extraction projects. Without consulting First Nations, Nova Scotia reversed a ban on uranium mining and hydraulic fracturing, better known as fracking. In Quebec, a proposed law could give lumber companies more leeway to clear-cut forests. Manitoba is now talking about a pipeline project. BC has its own project law, and so does Ontario. But the granddaddy of all these laws comes from the federal government. It's called Bill C-5.
We're giving Canadians the ability to give ourselves far more than any foreign government can ever take away. We can build big, build bold, build now, build one Canadian economy, build a better Canada for all and for all time.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking in Ottawa on June 6th. He was announcing the One Canadian Economy Act, legislatively known as Bill C-5. It's set to create an office overseen by a minister who will pick projects of national interest. But of course, there's a catch. Karyn Pugliese covers Parliament Hill and beyond for aptnnews.ca, and she joins me from Ottawa. All right, well, thanks for coming on the show again, Karyn. After hearing that clip, I'm wondering if we can start with the basics. What is this bill trying to accomplish?
Well, this was Mark Carney's answer that he talked about even, when he was running for leadership during the election, that he was going to counter the tariffs coming from the U.S. So as we all know, just a quick reminder, Donald Trump has instituted various tariffs against Canadian goods going into the U.S., which means that it's really hurting our economy, particularly auto sector and other manufacturing areas. And so, the vision behind this was that we can no longer trust trade with the US. It's our major trading partner, but really it has too much power over Canada's economy. And so the idea here was that Mark Carney said, we can make Canada an energy superpower. Let's get together and take down, one, provincial trade barriers, and two, just fast track some energy projects, like pipelines, mining, extraction projects, and get that energy, get those projects out to new economies. And so this means building transportation, railways, pipelines, everything to connect port to areas that are going to be developed. And this bill, what it effectively does is it does a couple of things. One, it lowers trade barriers in between provinces, at least the ones that the federal government has some control over. Two, it creates one window for approvals. So before, business would have to run to each ministry to go get various approvals for a project. Now there'll be one minister who's in charge. Like, it's one window where you go and that minister runs around and does all the running around to get those approvals for you. The other thing that it does is it declares some projects national interest projects. So that means that if Cabinet decides that a project is in the national interest, it can get fast-tracked. And that means that it can skip over some of these regular approval processes. And the whole idea was to get these approvals done in 2 years, rather than 5 or 10 or however long they normally take. And so that's environmental approvals and other consultation processes.
Now that we've kind of got the basics down, can you talk a bit about the main issues at play with Bill C-5?
Oh, there are many. Chiefs were already, before Mark Carney came in and started doing this, upset about the speed at which things move through. Consultations. It sometimes can take 8 months just to get funding to set up consultation process. There's environmental consultations and processes that things need to go through, and then a First Nation would get all this data about a project that's being proposed and have a chance to look at it, express their concerns. And so that's why it takes so long. And they were very nervous about hearing this, speeding up to like a 2-year process. But the other thing is the way that the bill does it. It's very unusual. Like they started using this term Henry VIII clauses, critics of the bill. I'd never heard this before, but it's referring to King Henry VIII because he used to just issue proclamations and get around Parliament. And essentially what the bill does is it gives extraordinary powers to Cabinet. So for example, if they're going to decide that something's like a national project, a national interest project, Cabinet gets to decide that, which is unusual. Like they don't have to discuss it with anybody. They don't have to say why it's a national interest project. They can just approve it and say it is. And it doesn't go back to Parliament for any scrutiny. And then the other thing is there's a list of regulations and laws that bills have to go through that's appended. So in this bill, you see down at the bottom, well, here are all the regulations that it has to go through. So it has environmental regulations. It has to be in line with the Indian Act and other laws. But Cabinet has the power to just delete some of those or skip some of those, for various projects. And again, they don't have to go back to Parliament to do that. They can skip over the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. They can skip over the Indian Act. They can skip over the Impact Assessment Act without parliamentary oversight. So it's extraordinary unusual. And while it mentions consultation throughout, like it keeps referring to the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People, and it refers to consultation. When I spoke to Elizabeth May and some other experts, Elizabeth May being the leader, of course, of the Green Party, but also an environmental lawyer, she said the part in the preamble of the bill is just no good. That's the kind of thing that if you go to sue the government over something or challenge law, the courts will look at the preamble to see the intent of the law, but there's nothing actually in the preamble that forces the government to consult. And in other places, the wording of consultations is very restricted. It's restricted to, by using words like may consult Indigenous communities or peoples who may be harmed by the project. Well, who decides may be harmed by the project? Like this is not clear at all in the law. So it's not what we're used to seeing. There was also, no non-derogation clause, which usually Indigenous people like to see in legislation. So that means a non-derogation clause is just simply a statement that says, usually in the preamble, that this law will not challenge or affect any existing constitutional rights that Indigenous people may have. And so it was really strange to see a law go through without that in there.
Crucially, this legislation mandates that there must be meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples, consistent with Section 35 of the Constitution and the duty to consult during both the process of determining which projects are in the national interest and the development of the rigorous conditions for each of those projects.
So that sounds pretty promising for an Indigenous community that isn't sure about, whether it wants a project on its territory. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, he said that. Like he said that there will be consultation, free, prior, informed consent. Those are his talking points, but it's not in the bill. So that's the thing that's important to know, is that he's making a lot of promises, but they're not actually written into the bill. And the other thing is this bill is being pushed through very quickly. He wants it wrapped up by Friday this week. And so that means that it's skipped over a lot of parliamentary processes and studies to get it rushed through. And National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Sneekemanak was testifying before the committee and saying, look, we have got First Nations right now that are basically burning up due to climate change and the impacts of climate change. And those leaders have no time this week to stop what they're doing and evacuating their communities, come down here and testify before Parliament. And that even if they did, 5 minutes before Parliament is not enough time for them to express their concerns. They had an emergency meeting of chiefs on Monday. By Monday afternoon, the national chief was before the Senate Committee of the All to testify. And Tuesday, she had to go back into the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities to testify and do all of this without even getting a proper mandate from chiefs, because they should be passing a resolution telling her that she can speak on behalf of First Nations communities, right? So she's falling back just on some regulations that they have in the AFN's constitution because she doesn't have time to even get a mandate. When I was talking to her prior to her testimony, she had barely had a chance to get the lawyer to take a look at the law. And she's not alone. Other leaders have complained, of the same thing, of the rush on this.
Mm-hmm. And, as this is all going on with, not essentially giving Indigenous leaders enough time to, share input into this, Canada, in their news release about this, said that there would be an Indigenous Advisory Council. And I'm wondering, based on what you've heard, what is the role of this advisory council? And do you have any idea of who might sit on it?
No, nobody does. And again, it's something that, as you pointed out, was in the press release, but not in the legislation. So we don't know who the advisory council is. I will note that the Carney government has been using the term Indigenous partners instead of Indigenous governments. And in some of its consultations, the brief consultations that it has had with Indigenous partners, it seems to be including people who are not necessarily elected leaders. If I look at the timeline, the Crown only provided information on the exact details of what Bill C-5 would be on June 6th. And then they provided this limited timeline on May 23rd, saying you have 7 days to look over a briefing note that we've just given to you and respond with all your concerns before we go to Parliament. And then the parliamentary rush to get it through started. So I have literally, in 20 years on the Hill, never seen anything like this. It's absolutely amazing. And I wrote today because Minister Golmasti was quoted by the Canadian press the other day as saying that Mark Carney was super open to some process of putting an Indigenous lens on a bill. So I wrote to the PMO and I said, is this new? Has the Indigenous caucus had a conversation with Mark Carney? What is this Indigenous lens? Who would be involved? And they sent me back a press release from June 2nd. And I wrote back to them and I said, well, wait a second. I said, please explain this to me. Are you telling me that when Minister Golmasti said this, which sounded like something new, it sounded like something had recently happened, or maybe there'd been some discussion in cabinet. You're telling me there was no discussion in cabinet when she made the statement on June 16th, that she was just referring back to what the Prime Minister had already decided on June 2nd. And they wrote back, we don't know, we don't sit in cabinet meetings, let me ask and get back to you. So we have no idea what an Indigenous lens is. We have no idea what an Indigenous Advisory Council is. None of this is in the legislation, and it is a government saying, just trust us. But I would say, for the experience Indigenous leaders are having, when Mark Carney is promising consultation and all these good things, I mean, really, that has not been the process that we've been seeing. He has sat down 4 times with provincial governments to get them on board with his ideas and his legislation. And as far as I know, he's had 1 meeting with quote-unquote Indigenous partners. He has met a few times with National Chief Neepanak. She has told me that, Woodhouse Neepanak. But, when I was asking her what they talked about, she said she was blindsided by this bill. She said, they were talking about things that a national chief would normally talk about, like education, infrastructure. She is not a rights holder, and she knows this. And so she was not talking to him about rights issues. She was talking to him about wildfires and evacuations and those kind of things that she has a mandate to speak on. So she was blindsided, she said, when she used that word, when this legislation came out with this very, very short time for feedback.
Mm-hmm. And so I believe it was on Monday, Indigenous leaders also went before the Senate to voice their concerns about Bill C-5. And here's some of what we heard from David Chartrand, Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak, and Natan Obed.
What does that consultation look like? How are you going to build it on a 2-year frame? How do you build these longer studies, for example, in the environment, where there's water, species of fish, and other things that could take science a lot longer to come to the conclusion of that effect? So How do we do that? So I think one of the options that they have right now is to give clarity and assurances both to the private sector, to us as governments, that there will be a time frame. There will be assurance to all of us, all parties, that we will have this consultation fully understood by all. And at least then we can all walk together. If not, you'll see matters back in court again.
Bill C-5 is one of the most significant federal bills First Nations have had to deal with in recent years. The powers of Bill C-5 are significant and present substantial risks to many, many collective rights of First Nations under our own laws, under the Constitution, and under international law. Accordingly, the Crown has obligations of deep consultation and consent. In the May 27 speech from the throne, the Crown stated, as Canada moves forward with nation-building projects, the government will always be firmly guided by the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Despite this clear commitment communicated by the sovereign himself, First Nations rights holders and organizations have been given an unreasonably tiny window, both before and after tabling, with much less engagement in a substantive exchange of views. It seems very, very few rights holders will have a chance to speak directly to the executive or to parliamentarians before Parliament determines the fate and shape of this bill. For those that do appear, how can any First Nations rights holders or organization even list the legal issues at stake in 5 minutes?
I also think back just a few weeks ago, being here in the Senate chamber with a speech from the throne from His Majesty the King. It has been Canada's weakness that it pats itself on the back for being a great champion of Indigenous peoples and a upholder of the rule of law and the respect for Indigenous peoples' rights. At the same time, acting very differently through its legislation and through its practice. And I think of those things as being born not only out of ignorance, but out of clear decision on whose rights matter and whose don't, and how to get to an end goal that makes Canada feel good about itself while still trampling on the very rights that it says it upholds.
So, what we hear in these clips is, very powerful resistance from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders. And I'm wondering, Karyn, do you think their words will have enough pull to influence the outcome?
I don't think so. I don't see how they can. Everything wraps up tomorrow. That's it. If you haven't gotten before committee to express some concern with this basically by Friday, I don't know that there's going to be a chance to say anything to Parliament in this process and get any changes made to the bill. So, and it does seem like, this is being pushed through a really strange alliance in between the Liberals and the Conservatives, who I really haven't seen work together in this way before. So they've got a backing of the majority of Parliament to push this through, to push it through quickly. And that means in both houses, because, senators are generally aligned with one party or another, even if it's not always formally. And it's really just the NDP and the Greens that are asking to slow it down. So there's nothing that says that, like always with these consultation processes, they're listening to what First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders are saying. But they don't have to actually do anything to amend the bill to make the changes they want. And even for, the National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse-Niebenack, she said, she hasn't had a chance to really discuss it. She hasn't had a chance to really study the bill in a meaningful way. And neither have First Nations. So, you heard in that clip, Métis President Chartrand saying, this could end up back in courts. Well, that's one way they can challenge the law, but that will be after the effect. And I guess otherwise, it will be maybe protests once these projects start out on the land.
Yeah, and there has been lots of talk of protests and actions that could come if this bill moves forward. But I'm wondering, how do you see this unfolding?
Yeah, it was interesting, particularly from the Ontario chiefs. I think because they were already a little bit mobilized with a provincial bill, it's a little confusing because the provincial bill is Bill 5 and this is Bill C-5. They're two different things. Bill 5 was Doug Ford's Speeding Up the Mining Process Act. And this one is these national energy projects, which is federal. So there was a protest on the Hill this week. About 350 people, I'm told, was the estimated number that showed up. Some young people, some chiefs. I think, when we look back at Idle No More, which is something that's been referenced a lot, that was a real grassroots movement. It wasn't something that was actually brought together by Indigenous leadership. So the question is, can Indigenous leadership, one, trigger that kind of protest? And I also just wonder how much, because this has gone through so fast, and it is flying by so fast, and it is such a complicated law that even the reporting on it in mainstream news has not been great, because they got really confused between things, like we pointed out earlier, that were promised in the press release and what's actually in the law. So I was just sitting here with the producer, Mark Blackburn, like last week, and we're reading like things in the paper, like there's going to be this Indigenous Advisory Committee. And then we're like, but it's not in the bill. Like, what's going on? And so, I think just this week is the first time that reporters have caught up with the bill, what's in it, what's not, and these absolute superpowers that we haven't seen before being given to cabinet that can make decisions and make decisions behind closed doors without being accountable to anybody for what they decide based on these projects, what gets declared a national project, and what hoops they have to go through or what environmental processes they can skip. So how much have people at home tuned into this, particularly in communities that are being evacuated for wildfires right now, particularly communities that are in other types of crises? They're probably, going to hear about this for the first time when something gets pushed through and it's actually impacting their land, and that'll be too late. So I don't know what's going to happen.
So earlier in this conversation, you mentioned, in your years of reporting on the Hill that you've never really seen something like this. I'm wondering, with this whole speed of how this is being pushed, what do you think is the tactic here? And do you think this is something we're going to see more with, approving energy projects?
Yeah, it's stunning, really. I mentioned that this is happening provincially, and I mentioned Bill 5 in Ontario, which creates these zones where mining can happen without facing all the scrutiny and rigor of environmental impact assessments. But there's a bunch across the country, that started exactly in the same way as Bill C-5 and Bill 5 did. So out in Nova Scotia, there was a moratorium on fracking since 2013. And the Conservative government out there, the moratorium was put on by a Liberal government. The Conservative Party out there never really agreed there should be an end to fracking. Now they're in power. Now they've got sort of the Trump emergency, and they are considering fracking again. And the Mi'kmaq are saying that they haven't been properly consulted. In Quebec, there's Bill 97, and that's the Quebec government's proposed forestry reform. And it operates kind of the same way that Bill 5 does, where it creates these zones only for forestry, where they can speed up forestry and allow it to skip certain assessments. And there's been protests out there by a couple of Indigenous organizations, and the Francis Vero-Paul, who's the head of the Assembly of the First Nations Quebec and Labrador, has spoken up against it. And then, there's Bill C-15 out in BC, which is, again, one that speeds up energy projects. And so I've never seen this speed through so fast in Parliament before, but it's lining up with all these other provincial bills that are to move these projects faster and get them done in a year or two. And, one of the things that I think, Chartrand pointed out when he was speaking is, can the science even keep up with that? Like, is it logically enough time in 2 years to do an environmental impact assessment And I guess it doesn't matter if you have the powers to just decide to skip it. We've never seen this before in Canada.
Well, thanks again for joining us, Karyn, and diving into Bill C-5 today. There's so much to unpack and not a lot of time, so really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, to Ontario's provincial government.
We're here today to talk about growth, about jobs, about making Ontario's economy the most competitive place in the G7 to invest, create jobs, and do business. We're here today to talk about the urgent need to unlock the full potential of Ontario's economy, starting with our abundant supply of critical minerals. Ontario is home to tens of billions of dollars worth of untapped critical mineral reserves, including in the Ring of Fire, the largest deposit of critical minerals in the entire world. These reserves can transform our economy. They can create new opportunities for First Nations, for northern communities, and all of Ontario. Ontario has every critical mineral necessary for the growth of advanced
That was Premier Doug Ford speaking in Toronto and announcing Bill 5. Its official name is the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act. But First Nation leaders are saying Bill 5 is actually going to unleash court challenges and protests because they weren't consulted and their treaty rights are being violated. That's because the legislation will create what the government calls special economic zones. These zones would allow it to override environmental and municipal laws to push a project like the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario forward. Sol Mamakwa is the deputy leader for the NDP in the Ontario legislature. He doesn't like the bill either. Mamakwa joins us on the podcast to share his concerns. Sol Mamakwa, thanks for joining us. So to start, for listeners who aren't familiar, can you tell us a bit about what Bill 5 is?
Yes, Bill 5 is a bill that was introduced by the Ontario government. The name of it is to Unleash the Economy Act. And basically what it does is it removes some of the environmental protections that are there, but also removes some of the archaeological things that are protected. Like there's different schedules, right? So different acts that are presented in its place. They're going to create these special economic zones, which again, like removes those processes, environmental and the Endangered Species Act. And I think one of the things that, from the First Nations side as well is, there was no consultation. There's no consultation in place for this bill, especially when we talk about, the trampling of inherent rights, treaty rights, and First Nation rights. And it's basically bulldozing their way through, to these territories, to these lands, these homelands. So where the big concern lies is the different acts that changes, that removes those protections, whether it's the environmental, the archaeological, and also, the Endangered Species Act. So that's very concerning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you just touched on this, but I'm curious if you could talk a bit more about how Bill 5 could impact or compromise duty to consult First Nations about development and projects.
I mean, for example, the duty consult is is a word to them. It's not an action word. They barely do the minimum, this provincial government, this Ford government. And example, like this, when this bill was written up, there was no consultation, no engagement at all. They just did it themselves, and to try. They're using this bill as a way to combat the tariff war that's happening between Donald Trump and also Canada. And I think that you cannot use this as an excuse to, access our territories, to access the Ring of Fire, to access our homelands. They access the minerals that we live on. And I think that's the big issue. And it's important to acknowledge that we cannot continue in this road for sure.
So as you mentioned, Premier Doug Ford says he's going to label the Ring of Fire as a special economic zone. What are the implications of this? Does this mean that the province can, essentially do what it wants to push these projects through?
Yes, the Ford government wants to recognize the Ring of Fire as a special economic zone. And what that means is certainly, again, you take away the duty to consult, you take away the environmental protections, you take away even the labor protections, right? And it's like it's like a no law zone. It's like wild west, and it's like the most egregious legislation that has been here, and it's something that we need to be able to fight back. And we have to understand the Ring of Fire, that area has, it's got the second world largest carbon sink in the world, and it's you cannot disturb that. And I think those are some of the things that aren't considered, right? So I think it will impact the ways of life, to the lands that we live in, not only just the lands, but the animals, the rivers, the people, the things that live in those territories. And it's not just us; these are our homelands, and you cannot just pay your way into into our territories. And I know some First Nations have agreed to that process, but a lot of First Nations are, again, you cannot trample on inherent rights, you cannot trample on treaty rights and that land rights. And I think that's something that's very concerning. And we're continuing to ask for this bill to be rescinded by First Nations, and not just First Nations, but I think it's some unions, but also environmentalists and others, right? It's not just First Nations that are asking to rescind this Bill 5.
And your writing encompasses the Ring of Fire, and I'm wondering, on a more human level, what have you been hearing from your constituents, and how could this impact their livelihoods, the livelihoods of the people that you represent in your writing?
We are very rich in the lands and the resources that we have, the waters and the animals, the plants and the trees that live in these territories and these homelands. And I think, when we start seeing development in these lands and languages, the identity of who we are and where we come from, the history is part of the land. And it's important to, we have to start looking at, not just our children, but it's our great-grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We have to make sure that they have access to these lands in 7 generations. And I think that's one of the key things that, the government's took our children away from the land, and now it's the other way around. They're taking the land away from the children. This approach, it's not working. And when we see First Nations reserves, sometimes you see the poverty that's there, the addictions, the overrepresentation of and see these things. But I think that we need to do it in a better way. But they're not. They're doing it in the most egregious way and the most colonial way that you can think of. And I think when you do things like that, what happens is it brings people together. It brings the rights holders together, and they start rising as nations and as people.
Mm-hmm. And, on a similar note to that, the Anishinaabe Nation has said, there's thoughts that this could bring a second wave of idle no more if Bill 5 passes. And I'm curious to know about your thoughts on this and how people are resisting Bill 5.
Yeah, there was a few weeks ago when I started hearing at Queen's Park from some of those 3 words, when leadership and people started talking about that, just gave me the shivers just hearing that, because those are words that people do not use very lightly. And I think the discussion and the dialogue that I keep hearing from people is, okay, we're going to do this, we're organized, and if there's no response, things are just going to elevate it a bit. And I think we're going to see this throughout the summer. And I think if there's no response, if the government does not rescind the Bill 5, and that's what you're going to see. And I think it's not just Northern Ontario, but there's others in Southern Ontario that will take this action, whether protest, and that's something that you will see things will escalate. And I think that's one of the things I warned the ministers about before, and because First Nations, our people will protect their lands no matter what it takes.
Going back to the kind of more political side of things, there's some talk that Premier Ford might use the notwithstanding clause if there's legal opposition to Bill 5. Can you explain what that means for our listeners?
Non-withstanding clause is supposed to be used on a very emergency basis. Yeah, I mean, certainly, we have to acknowledge that there's there's that terror war that's happening right now, and it's going to have a big impact on the economy. We understand that, but you cannot use this terror war to trample on the rights of the people that live in these territories. That's not right. And I think it's important that notwithstanding clause should be used in a better way, but not to trample on the rights of the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations peoples, and the rights holders of these lands. And that's not the way it's supposed to be used. And I think that's something that we need to be clear about. And again, the governments will continue to do this. And I know that, First Nations will continue to stand up for their rights. And it's very important that we protect our territories. I'm in my home First Nation today, and I know they will protect their land no matter what. And I think until the government wants to work with First Nations, not the divide and conquer approach, they're willing to help, but not in a way that they will trample on the rights, because that's not the way to do it. And it's important that they do not use this notwithstanding clause, and things are gonna happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my final question is, what are your next steps to fight against Bill 5?
For me, I'm going to start traveling this summer in my riding, and it's important, that people understand what Bill 5 is and also its impacts. We don't go back until October the 20th, and that's a long break. We're supposed to be back the first week of September. And I think, you will see some of the direct actions on the land, maybe on the highways, maybe railroads. So I think that those are some of the stuff that is going to happen. I'm not saying that it's, I condone that, but it's just something, again, I'm a messenger, right? People talk to me, and it's important to relay that message to the government, but they don't listen. I think they just want to continue to use, their power, whether it's police or their authority. They think they own these lands. They think they own Ontario. But then when we talk about these treaty lands, when you talk about these homelands, and First Nations are the rights holders of these lands and the right owners of these lands, and you cannot legislatively bulldoze your way into our territory. So, and that's been very clear. People will stand in front of the bulldozer if they're going to do that.
Sol Mamakwa, thanks so much for joining us today and giving our listeners some really valuable context on Bill 5.
Yeah, thank you.
This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. If you have any comments or ideas, email us at infocus@aptn.ca. You can find more APTN podcasts like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics on your favorite player. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to the place that thaws.